Rich, how we got to first ask, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. I appreciate it. Going along, coming along, dealing with everything that goes along with post-retirement experiences.
That's right, and I'm new. We just met a while ago, but Chris here you can't see on camera. He is your nephew, and he has told us that, or told me, you've had a very incredible 32-year career serving in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and 17 of those years you were a homicide detective. And of course, naturally, I told Chris, I'm like, I bet he has a ton of stories. And I know there are a lot of true crime aficionados out there. You have an incredible voice. You have a great way of telling the stories. And we thought this would be a great medium for a way for you to share your experiences and perhaps some of your method and your perspective, which I don't think is told that often from the detective's point of view, too often these days. So, as by way of introduction, I'm Umar Hussein. I live in Los Angeles, 34 years old. Chris, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris, 34 years old, based in Palm Springs, California. And Umar and I went to college together at UC Irvine. Shout out to the Anteaters, Zot Zot. And my Uncle Richard, I remember seeing you on Cops when I was a child. And it's just been really cool to see and hear all of these different stories, which we're excited to get into. And we're going to be taking it slow. We're going to be iterating, but ultimately, we're going to be diving in and exploring these cases. And like you had mentioned, kind of cathartic sort of process to this. But we're also going to, try to be as informative to the audience and to everyone as well. There may be some pictures and graphics that we may see over this, experience. So.
And to let the audience know, this is our first time doing this. You're gonna some of you may be watching us on YouTube on camera. Many of you will probably be listening to us on audio. If you want to get a look at the visual that Uncle Rich might provide for some of these cases, you could tune into our socials, which will have links in the bios, and find us on your favorite podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple. Like any good influencer, hit like, subscribe, follow.
Yes.
We think we have a star here in Uncle Rich, and I'm gonna kick it over to Uncle Rich, and if Uncle Rich, you could kind of give us a breakdown of, I'm sure there's a lot for you to talk about, 32 years, but give us like a little high level where your career started, who you are, what you represent, and then the next part, and maybe I'll cut you off if you're rambling too long. It rarely happens, but we'll kind of give the audience a sense of what can expect from the podcast and what your goals are.
Oh, sure. I really appreciate it, Umar. I would just say first and foremost, the fact that I grew up in East LA and I grew up in LA County Sheriff's area kind of gave me an idea of how they go about doing their business. And with that said, I wouldn't say that was very inspirational in terms of going into law enforcement, to be candid with you. However, I've always been orientated toward helping out the community. And after graduating from college, I decided to go ahead and do that because I appreciated the law, I appreciated how it was practiced, and in particular, I wanted to take a different approach, up to and including today where I teach at the local college. But that aside, I do not want to go off rambling. I'll just basically give you somewhat of a brief synopsis. In 1984, January of 1984, to be exact, January 18th. And it's funny, January 18th, 1984. And I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but over the years, I've arrested thousands of people, to be candid with you. And when I encounter a parolee, they always know the exact date when they go into prison, And so, to a large extent, I'm applying that same principle here, And so, and in that regards, January 18th, about 8 o'clock in the morning, I put my hand up and I swore to the United States Constitution. I'm not sure exactly how to recite that, but I'll just let you know that that's exactly what I did. And with that said, I went into a career in law enforcement, and there was an 18-week, it's actually expanded since, given the fact that I I taught and still do teach at both Rio Hondo and the Sheriff's Department's academies. But that aside, I started the academy 2 days after being sworn in. And you have to remember the context in which 1984 was. It was during the Olympics here in Los Angeles. But more than that, I experienced a rash of racism. And the majority of the police officers that were being recruited to Los Angeles were in fact from other communities outside of Los Angeles County, up to and including outside of the state of California. And so I was not very appreciative of some of those experiences, but I got through it. I was in many cases referred to as "Hey Mexican," but given who I am, I'm a very tolerant individual. I went ahead and realized that these were the kind of things that I was going to experience, even after graduating from the academy, where I received a police officer standard and training certificate. It was called the basic certificate. That said, and the reason why I mention that is because that laid the foundation for how I was going to do the academy. One of the things that I made note of was, and I remember in the academy, I said, I'm going to come back here and train these guys. And many of the individuals that I was in the academy with, as we referred to as classmates, they kind of chuckled because they didn't think that I had the intuitiveness to do something of this nature. But nonetheless, I then went on to the jails where I worked at Mins County, LA County, Mins Central Jail, which it has the dubious distinction, interestingly enough, by way of textbooks, as one of the largest populations in the United States of jail inmates. And at one point, we were so crowded, we were supposed to house in excess of about 8,000, and we were up to almost 12,000 inmates.
Wow.
I know. It was to the point where in a 8-cell, actually a 4-inmate cell housed 6 inmates, and 8 inmate cell had 10. People were sleeping on the floors and in the day rooms. And now I ain't going to go into the politics of that, but I will just say this: it did create sort of a dynamic that was very, very interesting, and I don't like to use the term, but I'll use it in this case, very dangerous. At one point, during the course of my experience, I remember there was only 3 of us. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. We were out in the yard, and there were 2,000 inmates waiting to get a bed.
Wow.
And I'm like, and all of a sudden I started hearing from the crowd, who, by the way, are very hostile to law enforcement. These are all suspects. It is 40 degrees outside. They all want a bed with blankets. Rush him, rush him. I'm like, I don't know if I should have taken this job.
No, forget a podcast. We could start a TV show.
Yeah.
And so at this point, we kind of were able to start calling out inmates' names, and the trustees were giving these guys blankets, and the crowd started to dissipate as they were going to their respective sleeping quarters, if you will. But and then I started doing some other things for the jail, up to and including, I just want to add this. It's a very interesting thing. Not that I wanted to in any way engage in this thing, but I ended up working at the hospital side. LA County Mins Central Jail has a hospital side, 6,000, 7,000, and 8,000. To the extent that in the 6,000 floor, they have handicapped or physically challenged inmates. We're talking about deaf mutes. We're talking about blind people. These are folks that have committed crimes. And there was at one point, I started becoming proficient in hand language, believe it or not. I mean, just because I had to communicate with them. Enter the 7,000 floor, which there was those folks that were, how can I put this, psychologically challenged. I guess I'll use the politically correct term. And there were many occasions where we had to literally strap him down. And you put one hand down here, one hand up here, and they were a danger to themselves. One occasion, this guy removed his entire clothes, and he was pounding on the wall, hitting his head, and we said, okay, well, we better strap him down. He's completely naked, mind you. We strap him down. Keep this in mind. He's completely naked. He's strapped down. 5 minutes after we walk away, there's a fire in his room. How he started that fire is beyond me.
Wow. Wow.
You guys have any questions?
I mean, that sounds like it was just the first 3 years of your career, huh?
Well, it's also interesting enough at the peak of the AIDS epidemic. So I was dealing with a lot of, volatility there. And we found that, and again, I'm no medical expert, but we found that a lot of individuals that were at the latter stage of their AIDS syndrome were in fact becoming very hostile. Now, mind you, you're dealing with, this potential lethal disease, and you're stuck in a box. But that's another story altogether. So I'm going to the other side of that 7,000 floor. And who walks in? None other than my namesake, Richard Ramirez. Yeah. And now I am providing security for this guy. Now, many of you probably are aware that Richard Ramirez was a notorious, killer.
Was he the Night Stalker?
The Night Stalker,
Okay.
exactly. And so I walked up to him, and this is a true story. He's in a one-man cell. He's got the little window. He's right by our control booth, and I look in the window just to check him out, and he sees my name tag, which says Ramirez, right? And I look at him. He looks at me. He goes, "What's your first name?" I said, "What do you think?" I said, "You ruined my life." That was 1986, man.
Wow.
Well, I can somewhat relate with the last name Hussein.
Okay.
It wasn't so fun until finally our president Barack Hussein Obama came.
There you go.
It was always a tenuous time telling someone my last name. So I feel your pain.
Wow.
That said, what I found particularly interesting was I ended up, we used to have what they call a sergeant escort. Now, believe it or not, the LA County Jail, Men's Central Jail, is so self-contained, we even have a dentist. And anybody that's familiar with his case, that he had disconfigured, his teeth were rather disconfigured, and he was biting people, so they were actually using that as evidence. Which, interesting enough, not unbeknownst to me, I was eventually going to start using that same doctor to do some of my dental examinations of my defendants. So we had 4 deputies and a sergeant, and we're taking them down the elevator in handcuffs. And when you have a high-profile inmate like that, and there's a whole lot of inmates in the clinic area, everybody stands up and turns around because you're not even allowed to see these guys. So we're all walking around, and I'm lifting a lot, because I'm getting ready to go to patrol, and we're all big bad deputies walking this guy, sergeant escort, and we walk him into the dental office, and he sits down, right? And as he's sitting down, I look behind me, and all the guys that I was with are gone. I'm like, and this guy, we just unhandcuffed him, and he's sitting on that dental chair. The dentist is not there. It's just him and I. And he starts to get up.
Uh-oh.
Exactly. And, mind you, this guy has poked out people's eyes. He's bit people and everything else.
Wow.
And I look at him. He looks at me. And I said, "Richard, don't do it."
Oh my God. What happened?
Tune in next time.
Yeah.
Yeah, see you guys.
Did he find that funny?
No.
Oh,
Actually,
gosh.
he was thinking, I don't know what he was going through his mind. Mind you, this man used to, at night, he would dance by himself. He was a strange cat. Matter of fact, just before I finished that story, down in 6,000 was a visiting area, and there was an excess of 5 or 6 women that would come to our window and say, "We want to go visit Richard Ramirez." These are gals that were gothic. I guess that's the kind of thing they're into. So going back
You
to
sure they were visiting him, or they were trying to see somebody else?
No, that was him. That was him. They would literally hang out there, and they would just wait. I don't know what the heck they were waiting for, but they would hang out.
Wow.
So the guy starts to get off his chair, and I told him, I said, "Richard, don't do it." And at the time, we were allowed to carry these flashlights, and they were pretty large. And I started to pull it out of my pocket. It was either that or run real fast out the room. So, and he decided he was going to sit back down on the chair. But there was that literally very close thing. Had we gone into blows, there's no doubt about it, he would have taken me out, because he's obviously a little more familiar with how to cheat when he fights.
Yeah.
But more than that, could you imagine a news story like that? Richard Ramirez fights Richard Ramirez.
Amazing. That's insane.
Yeah, so that was just one of the many experiences I had in terms of those issues, and I could go into many other issues, but and ultimately I ended up in main control. Did that for the remainder of my career, where I started doing scheduling and stuff. And then from there, I went to Norwalk Patrol, and started becoming more familiar with the patrol side of it. And that's an interesting aspect, because patrol versus the jail, people don't seem to understand this. Patrol versus the jail are two entirely different animals. I tell you these stories about the jail, but the reality is that if I'm into jail, I go, "Hello, I need some help over here with my little radio," and the whole world's going to show up within 2 seconds, Versus patrol, now you're on the streets, and there's no one to help you out. You literally have to develop your own survival skills. Now, mind you, can get on that radio, but there's going to be those occasions where they may not show up.
And then this is that second phase of your career, that 9 years you spent on the gang unit?
No, this is, I did a 3-year tour at Norwalk Sheriff Station, and where I get trained in patrol by an experienced training officer. I don't want to badmouth the man, so I'll just let you know. It was kind of an interesting training experience.
Okay.
And then within about 18 months of being there, I actually became a training officer myself. I guess they needed some. They were desperate for people, I guess. I don't know.
Or you were that good.
Yeah, one of the two.
Probably
nonetheless, so I ended up staying there, and I got there in May of '87, and I left there in December of '89, where my whole career trajectory changed. There was this commander who said, "For every gun that we take off the street, we stop 3 murders." Now, it's like, oh my God, that's fantastic. That's so much malarkey. I mean, think about it.
I was waiting to see which word you were going to use.
How do you equate the two? Think about it. You just can't,
Yeah.
But that aside, I got a lot of guns off the street. We would stop folks, and we were getting guns. And that was pretty much my whole primary purpose was and that patrol. But we were also what they refer to as a tactical response force. So in addition to when we were out there saturating, we were also at the history plays an interesting role in all of this. And so the riots began. And during that time, Powell, Kuhn, Presidio, and May were all going through the judicial process. And at one point, we were assigned to walk them to their cars because they were literally being threatened. And I found that interesting because I looked at May and I looked at Powell, and you could just see the enormity of responsibility that was on the shoulders of these guys. You look into their eyes, you could see that just the whole world was just unbelievable. I mean, you couldn't even interpret the level of concern that they had for themselves. I've never seen that in somebody, you know. And at one point, I was in the urinal with May. He was the youngest one. And I'm standing...
And just for those who aren't familiar, the names you mentioned, can you describe who they were?
Yeah, they were the 4 individuals, the primary 4 of the LAPD officers who were, in fact, using force on Rodney King. And so that side, I remember standing there, and my partner, he was standing next to me as we're all taking a leak. And Meg looks up at us and he says, like I said, he was the youngest, but he goes, you know, we thought he was on PCP, and I couldn't believe it because this doesn't happen in Kansas, you know?
Oh, man.
Exactly. Mike, who's from Boston, looks at him and goes, well, you're not in Kansas anymore. And I'm like, oh my God, here's a man that doesn't want to hear any kind of humor. Instead, that's what he comes up with, you know? You know, but needless to say, as you well know, what ultimately happened in that case where they were exonerated. But going back to what my scariest moment, one of the tactical experiences we were sent to LA County Art Museum, which is in LAPD's area, but it's the LA County Art Museum. And the governor at the time was Pete Wilson, and the Mexican president were there. And they were meeting for dinner at the LA County Art Museum. And unbeknownst to us, we were in the auditorium. They said, don't make yourself known, just stay. There was about 10 of us. Just stay in the room. We don't want to see you guys. The governor doesn't want to see you, and the Mexican president was want to say, oh, absolutely. So we order pizza, you know, and just doing absolutely nothing with ourselves. We had our little helmets and our little, you know, batons. All of a sudden, somebody comes and says, we need you out there. I'm like, what? And so now we grab our helmets and we grab our batons and we run over. If anybody that's familiar with Wilshire Boulevard, LA County Art Museum.
This is LACMA, right?
Is that what it is? LA County Art? Yeah.
Museum of Art.
Right, where they have the La Brea tar pits?
I think it's right by there.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So the audience members, it's they have the famous Urban Lights is a very iconic photo spot.
There you go.
For the LACMA, so to paint the picture of the scene.
I appreciate it. And so I look down Wilshire, I look westbound down Wilshire Boulevard, and I see about 2,000 to 3,000 people walking down the street, screaming and yelling, and they're apparently upset at Pete Wilson because he had rescinded an AIDS bill that he had promised the gay community. At the time, the term LGBTQ did not exist. And as they start coming toward us, they now right in front of us. We're talking about, there's only 9 of us, and there's about 2,000 to 3,000 people. And then coming from the east side, are a number of Mexican protesters protesting the Mexican president being there.
Oh, man.
And it's only 9 of us. And I always say I probably could have taken on about 100 on my own, you know, but...
So what just to jump into that scene, what is going through your head, and how are the other officers around you reacting, and what are the protocols to how to deal with the situation? I'm sure you guys first think, if I were in your shoes, call backup.
Which is what we did, interestingly enough. And as we call for backup, these folks are starting to slowly approach us, and they're about to push their way in. And I was rescued by a number of horses from LAPD. They showed up, and the asses of the horses started pushing people back, and ultimately we were rescued. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that was something that I could have conceivably had experienced had I not been rescued. And so I ended up spending about 4 weeks in West Hollywood because we were doing crowd control in that community. And you want to hear a little quick story? I kid you not, true story. So we are now having, there's a place called Barney's Beanery. I'm not even sure if it's there.
It's there.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating story.
There's a few of them now.
There's a fascinating story, which is even more amazing.
Yeah.
Because we were told, you guys hang out in front of Barney's Beanery. So we created a scrimmage line so nobody could come in. Why was that? And the reason why, maybe I shouldn't say this because I'll be, I don't know whether they're going to call me on the carpet for this.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but let me tell you the story.
We're not cutting it out.
We're all there, and as we're waiting on a scrimmage line, probably a group of about 200 to 300 people are protesting in front of there. Because the guy, whoever owns this place, this is in the middle, the heart of the gay community here in Los Angeles, West Hollywood. He puts on his door, no faggots allowed.
Oh my God.
I'm like, why are we protecting this guy?
I mean, another interesting question you got to deal with every day, right? Because you're not allowed to pick the sides, but you are there to preserve the peace.
There you go. Right. That's a very, very good way of putting it, and I wholeheartily agree with that. Anyway, so there was a number of things that we did, and like I said, I during the Rodney King protest. By the way, that incident at the LA County Art Museum was pre-Rodney King, and I just give you one quick story that I found fascinating because it really showed how a society can devolve. And I was on the corner of Florence and Alameda, right at the heart. That whole area, Firestone, Florence, all of those areas were in flames when I got there. So we're at the corner there, and we're with a group of Marines, and there's actually a tank on the corner. And this Marine, it was a checkpoint for anybody that was coming through that down Florence. And this Marine, it's evident that he was not from California. In his southern accent, I wouldn't try a southern accent, but he comes with his M16. He walks up to this car, and there is a probably anywhere between 24, 25-year Hispanic female, and next to her is a 5 or 6-year-old, what appears to be her daughter. And he walks up and he looks, he's holding his weapon on his shoulder, and he goes up to her and he says, "Where are you going, ma'am?" Right? And as he walks up to her, this is interesting because this was post Iraqi war, which I was at that protest on that one too, but that's another story. As he walks up to her, a colonel who was on that intersection grabs the Marine by the shirt, his back of his shirt, his uniform, his collar. Okay. Pulls him back. He goes, "What are you doing, Marine? You should be pointing your gun at her."
Oh my God.
I'm like, whoa, man, these people aren't fooling around. This is not a DUI checkpoint. Yeah. This is a full throttle military, control of our communities here in LA. And so I was like, this is pretty heavy. And and that story, it was etched in my memory in terms of what I was doing, and I'll never forget that. I just never forget that.
You've obviously dealt with some very serious situations, and of course you've been managed to keep a humor about yourself, and I'm sure part of that is helping you keep you sane with everything you've dealt with, even though everything you deal with seems to be a very serious subject matter.
It's a change of mindset. Yep. Entirely. You're no longer driving a patrol car.
Yeah.
So you're no longer, you don't have that level of I guess, high profile as you would as a detective. Suddenly now you've relegated to just driving around in a detective car that doesn't have all the markings, and people don't see you in the context of, oh my God, I'm going to get a ticket.
Right.
And so the change when I went to investigations clearly changed the dynamic of how I went about doing policing. But I would just add this, and in 1993, when I went, I was assigned to East LA Station, which, by the way, that was not a request on my part. I didn't say, let me go back to East LA because this is where I grew up. I actually did not necessarily relish the thought of going there, but I said, hey, I want to be a detective. So, and the East LA, I wasn't, interestingly enough, I wasn't part of the station. I was still part of the gang unit, only working gang investigations now. And that in and of itself sort of prepared me to a large extent into going into homicide. So let me just tell you this. Working as a gang investigator, you develop a lot of relationships with the gang members in the context of not necessarily becoming their friends, but many of them rely on you. Many of them are from single parent homes, or even no parents for that matter. And in many instances, you have a certain level of sympathy for them, even though many of them are committing, some very heinous crimes. I mean, and I think in that regards, working East LA in particular, I kind of had a level of empathy. And more than that, it did not necessarily in any way stop me from taking these folks to jail. I took a lot of these people to jail. I mean, just in an effort to keep the community safe. But more than that, it was investigating robberies, assisting homicide, investigating murders. In 1995, while I was there, 1994-95, we had probably in excess of about 125 murders. I walked into the doctor's hospital right there on Whittier Boulevard, where I was born, by the way, and I saw Casper from the King Cobra gang. And as I walk out, this is the most interesting story. As I walk out, I look north on Whittier Boulevard in Record, and there's another dead body. I'm like, what? It's 3:00 in the morning.
Oh my goodness. The job never ends.
No, and the worst part about it was seeing some of these kids, in particular, watching this one 16-year-old who had just been shot and seeing his eyes roll back as he goes away.
Oh, man.
I mean, I'm thinking to myself, wow. Mm-hmm. And so those are the kind, and then to boot, you, like I just mentioned, here I am developing rapport with some of these kids, 15, 16-year-old kids. And the next day, they're found dead, And so I you kind of have to have a level of understanding and a level of trying to commit yourself to doing this despite it all. And that's the primary reason why I took a lot of guns to jail. I mean, I was literally taking a lot of folks to jail. And I didn't worry about the consequences. I figured the courts were going to deal with that. My objective was just to try and keep the street safe. And like I said, I've done a number of investigations in that regards. But let me just touch on one last thing in terms of those 5 years that I was at East LA. Many of these homicide investigators, and I will just say this right now, and you guys can please put this on recording because I will not in any way shy away from this particular opinion. And that is when I went to a homicide scene, maybe when they called me from my home, I wasn't part of homicide, I'd get to the scene, I'd see a dead body, and there would come homicide investigators. The following day, I would never see those investigators again. There was only a few investigators from LA County Sheriff's Homicide that would show up and that would actually want to follow up and want to solve their cases. Now, that in and of itself spoke volumes about why I went there, because I said to myself, wait a minute, if they don't care, maybe I do. And I'm going to make an effort to try and help these folks out. Because there's nothing worse than seeing a crying mother as a result of that person, their son or daughter being killed. And that's where I made a commitment, because I realized at that point, and I took copious notes. Don't get me wrong. I was like, because the investigators weren't doing their cases, I was making sure that I was going to be able to do those cases. And I had a kind of an interesting way. For instance, if I saw a group of gangsters and they were driving, or I would stop and, hey, how you guys doing? You know, because they knew who I was, I knew who they were, and then I would take a picture of their car, but they didn't know it. And later on, and lo and behold, there they are. They're down in La Puente doing some kind of caper with that stupid car of theirs. And I was solving a lot of cases for homicide.
Wow.
So that's how that worked in terms of issues. But, you know, I mean, I could tell you a whole lot of stories regarding how I went about doing my investigations. It was a unique way of doing things, which to an extent, going back to your point, Chris, which was, it wasn't cops, it was LA detectives. And on one occasion, this is funny, I was doing a search warrant on a house. It was a multi-location search warrant on a house, which is the profile of that one particular case where this guy shot at this guy with his kids in the car. But what was interesting was, I'm like, I don't want to be on TV. I already have enough high profile, you know, stuff going on in East LA. I don't need that kind of you know, notoriety or right. And so these two investigators show up. I was going to brief them on my search warrant, and they come in and I start talking to them, and then they walk out, and the lady walks out, the camera lady, I can't remember what production company it was. Then she comes back in by herself. And I said, did you need something? She goes, yeah, we're going to follow you around. I said, follow me around? Why are you going to follow me around? She goes, we want to know what you're doing with your search warrant. And I said, well, I'm not particularly fond of that. I don't, you know, I'm not doing that. She goes out, comes back again. She goes, your lieutenant has ordered you to have me follow you around. That's why you saw that. And what's interesting, I'm working East LA, right? And another incident, well, it actually was an incident, wherein my good friend Mike Del Muro was, him and I, and Mike wanted to be on TV. So he goes, hey, can you just come with me? And I'm, all right, Mike, I'll come with you. But you're going to be the one, right? And I can show you guys the video. It's a fascinating video. Fascinating, oh shit. So
maybe we'll post it on our YouTube channel.
Please do. I'll give you an excerpt of it. The weird part about it is that we're down and we're watching these kids practice for their quinceañera. And then we get back in the car. We're having a good time. We're, you know, community relations, you know, being out there. And all of a sudden we get a call of a murder up in the hills of East LA. And all of a sudden, where the location is, who the players are, I knew them all. And suddenly the freaking cameras go from Mike to me. And I'm like, oh man. And now there's a dead guy on the street, and he's like, And make a long story short, we ultimately ended up, turns out that his brother was shooting at a car and accidentally shot his brother in the back of the head.
Oh,
I'll show you that video. You get a chat.
Yeah, we'll
but
post it.
But again, the point being, I'm just one of many experiences I had with regards to working East LA. And one last story. When I first got there to East LA, this group of it was a group from they were not Fargo, but another little town within I guess North Dakota or wherever it was. They came with a movie with a film crew, newscasters, and they were going to do a week-long expose up because they didn't want it to happen over there, right? So they showed up, and here's this guy. I thought I was in a war zone. This guy, and it was probably So ironic, so coincidental. This news reporter, he's with the camera. He's got a flak jacket on with the big collar.
Yeah.
I thought he was like and he's holding his mic. I'm in East LA right now, and while this is all happening, there's a helicopter.
Oh no!
Oh my god!
To add to the dramatic effect.
Oh yeah, it was. I've been trying to find that video. I want to get that expose. I did have it for a while. I don't know where it's at. But I found it and I was like, I don't even want to go back to work. I'm too scared for that.
Oh my god. Well, I mean, it sounds like, obviously you went from the jail to patrolling on the street and, from, as you mentioned, going from patrol to going to, actually investigating. You got that inspiration when you saw perhaps, the perhaps lack of care or competency on the gang side in East LA from the homicide office, and so you kind of got yourself in there. And of course, it's a very high profile area, East Los Angeles. There's been a lot of history there,
Right.
but you've lived it. I could see this being very relevant for those who probably do want to get entertained, but also those who are very curious about law enforcement, homicide detectives, and then also for I'm a lawyer by education. I don't practice law, but I could see these getting helpful for criminal law students as well, or future police detectives.
You bring up a lot of interesting points, but I would just say this. One of the things, and so we could go into that transitional stage, because in 1998 I went to Homicide while after working in East LA. Now East LA, I was specifically targeting street gangs, but what it gave me was this plethora of experience by way of how I was going to apply that in a homicide capacity. And I'll just give you, so whether by way of investigations, we're talking about whether it be identifying a suspect, whether it be a live lineup or by way of a photographic six-pack, or maybe going through a litany of photos, of gang photos that we had. We also want to talk about in terms of the specific elements that are associated with an investigation and not violating people's constitutional rights, because all of those are going to come to the forefront when you go to court after taking somebody to jail. Now, here's why I tell you that, and I brought this up in the past, is that when you find yourself in a situation where you're about to take somebody into custody, that right there, that point where you put that handcuffs on him, you put this person in the backseat of your car, you are now moving into a completely different realm of the investigation, wherein now the courts are now scrutinizing by way of attorneys, both the district attorney and your criminal defense attorney, and I might add, even your civil attorneys, to find out if there's the prospect that they could conceivably capitalize on your incompetence by way of violating their client's rights. So there is a host of issues that you have to look at and develop and understand. So East LA gave me a really solid foundation because it was a busy place, and it was a whole hell of a lot of people and a whole hell of a lot of crime, up to and including a lot of murders. So that I got a really good grasp. Now, with that said, going into homicide, and this is where the transition goes in, and this is what I'm going to talk about, Omar, and that is that when you get to homicide, it's not about gangs. I mean, I could talk about cases from a suicide all the way up to a police officer's death. I could talk about baby deaths. And here's the interesting part about LA County, is that LA County Sheriff's Homicide covers the entire county. People often ask me, what area did you work? You worked the entire county, from Malibu all the way to the lovely city of Walnut, from Lancaster, which is on the border of Kern County, all the way down to Long Beach. So anywhere there was a death, and if I was on call, I was going to be responding to that particular location. Now, mind you, I think, what's there, 23 million people in LA County?
That's what I was just wondering. I'm like, how many folks is that covering? That is Los Angeles is a large city.
Right, the county itself. And with that said, there's only 72 of us. Wow. And of those 72, probably about 20 of those guys are finding some means or ways to get out of work. Oh, okay, yeah. So now you shorten that list.
Is it not a coveted job within the police
force? It
is
the most coveted position of a 12,000 man department. Cool. Now, how many guys actually want to do it is another story altogether. But the reality is that...
so a lot want to be there, but a lot don't want to,
yeah,
once they get there, actually doing.
And this is what is interesting, is because if they want to be there, they want that beautiful title of a homicide detective, but do they want to cross that threshold? Mm-hmm. And this is what we talk about. I mean, and I mention this so we understand as we go into this, is that there's things called a solve. You could solve. I could put anybody's name on a piece of paper and say that's the guy that did it. It doesn't matter. There's no evidence against that person. But how about prosecuting? Now that's an entirely different realm. When you put your handcuffs on that guy and you take him to jail, now the true colors come out in terms of how your investigation was evolving and the challenges that are associated with it by way of the issues, whether it be challenges on the true identity of the suspect, the challenges of whether you violated somebody's rights by way of the Fourth Amendment rights. We're going to be talking about that in this upcoming case, regarding whether or not there was some level of in terms of the investigation and how it went forward, and what I had to be concerned with during the course of that investigation, without making sure that anybody's and everybody's rights were going to not be violated. So these are the kind of things that you really have to think about. And I go back to East LA and the host of experiences that I had, and I brought that forward. And by the way, just along the lines of that question, a lot of guys do want to go there, but are not allowed to, because when it comes right down to it, when it comes to law enforcement, you have to have a level of trust, and you have to have a good reputation to make sure that you're not going to just run amok. And so, in that regards, I was able to develop that reputation.
Maybe for another episode, we would love to hear what that vetting process is like to actually make the homicide detective department.
You know what? Absolutely, and I could. It's a fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah, we got to do that. And
fascinating.
Also, going back to a point earlier, I just looked it up, but it looks like, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, Los Angeles County is 9.83 million folks as of 2021. That doesn't include the 3.8 million that are attributed to Los Angeles itself. So, it's a large number. That's a large area you had to cover.
Absolutely.
I hope there weren't days you had to drive from Walnut to Malibu.
There was. I've had a couple of occasions, and I gave you some. And one last thing along those lines, whether it be a response, which is just a single man investigation, would be a suicide or a baby death. We generally didn't respond to overdoses unless it was a juvenile, and those are cases that don't require follow-up. But then, of course, we do have the homicide investigations, which are two-man investigations. And the only reason I mention that is because I have one case which was a response, ultimately resulted in a response, which should have been a single-man response, but probably one of the weirdest. And I'll tell you guys that on the next episode.
Yeah. Let's keep the audience guessing.
Yeah, this was some. It's some weird shit. The weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life, man. And people are going to be flabbergasted. Their jaws are going to drop when I tell them this story.
Well, we can't wait. We can't wait. I think that's a good place, if any, to kind of take a pause, and I think to set up the next episode here, and hopefully that this episode's given the audience a sense of Uncle Rich's experience here, and what he's gonna elucidate in the coming episodes. But our next episode, it takes place in the city of Signal Hill, which is nestled, according to Google, between Los Angeles and Long Beach County, for those who are not familiar. But it incorporates one of the worst burn victims you have ever seen in your 32 years. Is that right, Uncle Rich?
That's correct. And I would just say this much. The fact that I have photos reflective of that, I think everybody, your audience will definitely will agree with my description in terms of what it looks like and how it occurred and how accomplished that person was in doing this. That's the most frightening part about this.
And with that, we thank you for listening to episode 1 of When Death Awaits. Stay tuned for the next one.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, good night.